Well, I'm supposed to be wired up for a mic. Can everyone hear me? Oh, yes, good. Well, my poor wife Barbara will have to live with me after that introduction, Greg. You should apologize to her. But thank you, very kind. And I'm going to talk to you today about a visit that Barbara and I made to New Zealand a couple months ago, and it was probably in part due to Tom Sheehan, who's here somewhere. I don't see Tom, but there he is. So Tom had made a similar trip to New Zealand and had met many friends, and they invited Barbara and me to come, and we certainly enjoyed it. Thank you, Tom, for your help. And the issue was that New Zealand is a huge agricultural country. It grows lamb to feed the world. It grows butter, milk, wool, and they're under tremendous political pressure from the virtue signaling local elite, you know, to stop their cows from burping and their sheep, you know, methane. And so, I know how methane works. You know, I've spent my career working with how methane absorbs radiation, and so I knew a lot about it. And I decided to go and try and help them argue with their local politicians that this is really a waste of time, waste of resources. So if I could, let's see, let me get the next slide if I can. So here's a summary of the talk. It's true that cattle emit methane. They have to emit methane. You know, we'll say more about why that's so. But it really almost doesn't matter to the climate. For example, New Zealand has set a target to reduce methane emissions by 14% over the next decade or so. The effect of that would be to lower the temperature of the whole Earth by 0.00001 C. So you have to ask yourself, why are we doing this? You know, is there any reason the Earth cares whether the temperature is, you know, 0.001 lower or higher? Of course it doesn't. It is a complete madness. And you can ask the next question, and that is, suppose you go the whole way. Why this puny 14%? Let's kill every cow in the world. We'll kill every sheep in the world. Kill all the ruminants. They're all burping methane, that evil gas. And how much will that affect the temperature of the Earth? Well, it would only lower the temperature of the Earth by 0.05 C. You can't measure that. So in spite of what you hear about methane, it's all nonsense. It's not true. So this is not, of course, the first fanatical attack on cattle. Cattle have been our friends for, you know, millennia, and thank God for cattle. But here's a cautionary, well, let's see, a cautionary tale here. I first learned about this incident, by the way, from a little pamphlet that was published by the Heartland Institute due to Joe Bast. It was called Roosters of the Apocalypse, and it turns it's a terrific thing. I think you can probably still find it on the internet. But in 1856, this young woman, Gwasi, who was a member of the Xhosa tribe in South Africa, had a vision that if her people killed all the cattle, that it would cure every possible ill that was affecting her tribe. You know, the white settlers would be driven into the sea, the cattle diseases would stop, they would have new cattle coming back from the dead. And people believed her, especially the elite. And so they forced everyone to slaughter their cows. They slaughtered hundreds of thousands. The result was hardly surprising. 80,000 people starved to death the next year. They didn't have enough to eat. And it resulted in the political collapse of the Xhosa society, made it very easy for them. everyone else in South Africa to taking advantage of them. I should point out that she made these predictions when she was about the same age as Greta Thunberg. Okay. Well, let me just summarize the results of this talk. We wrote a little paper after the trip that Barbara and I took, and the authors included a Spanish speaker, Albrecht Lotzley, who some of you probably know, and Albrecht has translated the basic results of our paper into Spanish, and so this is for our friend Doug Pollock and anyone else who speaks Spanish in the audience, but it summarizes these ridiculously small changes of temperature that you get from killing all the ruminants in the world. It really doesn't make any difference. The co-authors were Deborah Alexander, who was my host in New Zealand, Jim Ferguson, who's a veterinary nutrition specialist from University of Pennsylvania, Albert Lotzley from Paraguay, myself, and William Van Weingarten, Canadian. So it's an international team. So here are the poor cows who are under threat. Okay, so I'll try and keep this not too long. It's after all a lunchtime talk, but I will say a little bit about biochemistry. It's quite interesting, why you have to emit methane if you're a cow. A little bit about radiation transfer physics, which is what determines how the methane affects the temperature. Answer is almost not at all. And then if there's time, we'll have some questions. So here is a Princeton physicist cow, and it's cartoon. But the main thing about a cow, if you look at a cow, he's got this huge belly. And the belly is to make room for the rumen, this enormous stomach, which is where the forage first goes. And the stomach is anoxic. There's really no oxygen in here. And so after the cow has eaten this fill in the pasture, it sits down, or she sits down, and she ruminates. She burps up cud from the rumen, chews it, and as she chews it, methane bubbles out of the cud into the air. So it's true that cows are producing methane, yet they can't avoid it. And all sorts of other things are going on in here, but I would point out that the reason the cow emits methane is that the last step in digestion in the rumen here is combining hydrogen and CO2, which are produced by this zoo of microorganisms, to make methane and get a little topping energy out of here. The cow gets energy from making methane. If you stop it from making methane, then it doesn't get as much food value from its forage. And the reason for that is that, unlike us, cows can digest fibers, cellulose, so let's talk a little bit about why there's cellulose in the world. Cellulose is actually made of sugar. It's the same thing we were having for lunch here, glucose. So for example, I can eat all this paper I like. It doesn't give me much nourishment, but a cow, if it eats this, gets some nourishment, right? So both the paper is made of glucose, just like my dessert, but I can't get food value. So let's remember, how does photosynthesis work? Well, sunlight comes in and is used by the plant, by the chloroplast in the plant, in a little factory that takes hydrogen from water. It has to take some energy to do that, so the energy comes from the sunlight, takes off the hydrogen atoms, and it attaches them to NADP to provide hydrogen to make sugar later on in a second factory. And at the same time, this little chloroplast factory makes energy, which is transmitted as ATP, down here. So this is the output of the factory, the input, which is water and sunlight. Then there's a second factory in the cell, and this factory uses the hydrogen that's been produced by sunlight and the energy produced by sunlight to combine carbon dioxide and water to make sugar, to make glucose. So that's the basic step. So the basic product of photosynthesis is always glucose, a 6-carbon sugar here, down here. You can think of it as a polymer of a carbohydrate. It looks like it's a carbon attached to a water molecule, but actually a slightly different arrangement. Now, glucose can be a linear molecule like this, but most of the time it folds back on itself to make a ring. So the great majority of the glucose in your dessert is in one of these forms, this form or this form. A percent or so is linear. And there are actually 2 ways that it can form a chain. In one way, where the chain closes, an OH is on the bottom, a hydroxyl on the bottom. The other, it's on the top. So this is called alpha glucose. This is beta glucose. Both of these are fine. We can eat either of them. This is about 60%. This is about 30%. Polymers of this are starch. So bread is a polymer of glucose. It's easy to digest starch. You know, if you chew on a piece of bread, which is starch, then it starts tasting sweet. That's because just the saliva in your mouth is breaking apart this polymer to make sweet glucose. But you can also make a polymer out of beta glucose, which is 60%. It's the most abundant one in life. And that makes cellulose, that makes paper, you know, or wood, which you can't digest, but the cow can. So that's the magic of ruminants, that they can digest this chemical, which is the largest part of primary production. It's not sugar and starch, it's actually cellulose. So, but in doing that, unfortunately, the final step is this demon gas methane, which is destroying the world. And so that's why cows are under attack, because in the process of breaking down the cellulose, which they do with the aid of various microorganisms in the belly, in the rumen, they have to end this process by making methane. Okay, so now let's say a little bit more about that. You have to wonder, though, about why are we concerned? Because ruminants have been around the world forever. You know, when Europeans settled America, it was enormous herds of buffalo, which are sort of the quintessential ruminant, and the buffalo probably emitted a lot more methane per buffalo than a Hereford cow per cow, because the forage of a buffalo is mostly fiber. So they get less quality food and have to produce more methane than a cow. So people have done studies to see what is the difference between methane emitted in the year 2015 by beef cattle and what was emitted by bison. These are numbers I'm quite sure have all been pushed down for political reasons, but it's almost certain that the bison emitted a lot more methane in the year 1500 than cattle do today in the year 2026, at least in America. So the whole thing, you have to scratch yourself, why are we doing this? All right, now that's your course in biochemistry. So now we're going to talk a little bit about radiation physics transfer. And so the rap on cattle is that the methane will cause intolerable warming of the earth. I've just told you the warming you can't even measure. But the basic physics behind that is qualitatively right. The trouble is it's quantitatively wrong. And let me remind you, if you go outside today and you send up a balloon to measure the temperature will drop rapidly as the balloon goes up. It's typically somewhere between 6 and 10 centigrade per kilometer. And this is the lower atmosphere, the troposphere. Then the temperature starts rising again if you go way up. Jet planes like to fly here at the top of the troposphere where the air is a little bit quieter and you don't get so much turbulence. So they're designed to operate there. And then there's a stratosphere. The difference between these two parts of the atmosphere is in the troposphere here, as the name implies, air is always rising and falling, rising and falling. You feel that when the plane comes in for a landing. You typically get a lot more turbulence from this. Above the tropopause, the air is quite stable. That's why it's in strata and layers. So all of that plays into the way methane warms the Earth. And so it warms the Earth through the greenhouse effect, which we all keep hearing about. And here's how the greenhouse effect works. The temperature of the Earth is determined by the sun. We get a little bit of heat coming up from the interior of the Earth, but it's 1,000 times less than the sun, more than 1,000 times less. So we're dominated by sunlight. And if there were no greenhouse gases over on this right panel, the warm Earth that's been warmed by the sun would radiate long-wave radiation back to space, and this radiation would increase until it exactly balances the heating from sunlight. So cooling from infrared balances heating from sunlight. But it doesn't have a straight shot in the infrared because even without clouds and clear air, there's water vapor, there's CO2, and this scatters the infrared that's trying to get to space. It makes it a little bit harder for the Earth to cool than it would if there were no greenhouse gases, and so that's the warming from greenhouse gases. So there really is a greenhouse effect. It really does warm the Earth. It's a good thing that it does. Makes it possible for us to live here. Okay, but the effects are very small, so this is an important thing because now this is beyond just so stories, and this is quantitative physics. Okay, so the quantitative physics is if you look down from space, what you will see coming up from the Earth at different frequencies of radiation. So this is infrared radiation at different frequencies, low frequencies, high frequencies, is a jagged curve here. This is called the Schwarzschild curve in honor of Karl Schwarzschild, who was a terrific German physicist back in the early 1900s. He died during World War I on the Russian front, not from Russian bullets, but from a horrible autoimmune disease that got worse because of the trench warfare conditions. And anyway, he showed us how to predict this curve, and as I'll show you what he predicts and what you measure, you can't tell the difference. They're really close. But now the important point about this curve is this is radiation that's cooling the space. It's the area under this jagged curve. If you were to double CO2 concentrations, that jagged red curve would be replaced by this red, that jagged black curve would be replaced by this jagged red curve, which is almost identical. So the effect of doubling CO2 is only a 1% change of radiation to space, only 1%. It's the tiny difference between this black and red curve. So, it's really hard to get alarmed about 1% in radiation, but it's even more discouraging for the alarmists if you think about the next step. And so the next step is, let me just, before going to the next step, this is one of my heroes. This is Max Planck. Max was the one who figured out how radiation really works and invented quantum mechanics as a result of that. But Planck's curve is this blue curve. So you'll often see papers which mention the Planck curve here. Yeah, that's almost never observed. I've never seen an experimental Planck curve, but I've seen lots of Schwarzschild curves, and they agree with what you predict. Planck's son was shot by the Nazis for being involved in a plot to supposedly overthrow Hitler. So he had a hard life. But I mentioned that you can hardly tell the difference between models and calculations. So if you use the Schwarzschild curve and you calculate what radiation coming up to space should be from the Earth, and you look what's observed from a satellite. Here's calculated, here's observed. The dashed red curve is the Planck curve. Here's over the Sahara Desert where it's hot. Notice that the scales are different here, so this is more radiation on the top two panels. Here's over the Mediterranean where it's cooler. Again, you can hardly tell the difference between calculation and observation. This is interesting. This is over Antarctica, where there's very little radiation. You see the scale top here is only 60 versus 200 over the Sahara. But this is carbon dioxide, and over the Antarctic, carbon dioxide is an anti-greenhouse gas. It makes Antarctica cool faster than it would without CO2. So there's lots of complexity here, and you have to get it right. And when you get it right, there's nothing alarming. So I won't try to give equations, but this is a pretty good analogy to why greenhouse gases are so ineffective. Yeah, they do cause warming, but the warming is very, very small. And so, the current amount of CO2 and methane we have in the air is like a coat of red paint on the barn. If it's a good coat of red paint, the barn will look nice and red. And now you might say, well, I want my barn to really look red, so I'm going to put another coat of red paint on it, and you're wasting your money, because when you put the second coat on it, it will look just the same. If the first coat is good, the second coat is also, it doesn't make any difference, because you only take one coat. And that's the way CO2 is today. CO2 has really saturated the color of the Earth in the infrared part of the spectrum. So there is some warming, but it's very small warming. It's less than 1 degree if you double CO2. It's a very small effect. And one of the reasons for that is associated with two other interesting guys here. This is Joseph Stefan, who was he's the only famous Slovenian physicist I know, but Stefan worked in Vienna in the 1800s, and 1850, 1860, and he discovered this famous law. It's now called the Stefan-Boltzmann law. But it says that the flux that a warm body emits out into space goes as the fourth power of the temperature. There have been many attempts to figure that out long before. The French had worked on it. Nobody got it right, and he was such an experimental genius that he designed an apparatus that he was absolutely certain there was a fourth power. Laws like this are not very common in physics. Most laws are more complicated. This is a simple one. But the point about that is, because of that fourth power, just a little increase in temperature compensates for a big change in flux. So if you reduce flux by 1% by doubling CO2, the temperature to compensate only has to be 1/4%. So because of that famous fourth power here. Okay, so there's a greenhouse effect from both carbon dioxide and methane, and of course from the most important gas of all, water vapor. But none of them are anything to worry about, and none of them are going to change very much. The warming that we're observing for the last 2 centuries, which began around 1800, is almost certainly mostly a natural recovery from the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was clearly ending around 1800, because that's when glaciers in Alaska started melting, and in other parts of the world. And that warming was quite substantial before there was any increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is like many previous warmings. It's not an unusual thing, and it's not due to evil SUVs. Well, here's how methane is changing with time. It's slowly going up. When you look at a graph like this, if you learn nothing else from this talk, remember to always look at the scale. On the left-hand side. People like to fool you, by flashing this off. You notice this change is 189 to 194, it's 2%. It looks big, doesn't it? It's only 2%, yeah. And So methane is increasing. Nobody's quite sure why. There was a period of decrease a decade or two again, but it's hovering around 1,900 parts per billion. Okay, and here's a similar Schwarzschild curve for methane. Black is the current amount of methane. Red is if you double methane, and you're not talking about anything like doubling methane from killing all the cattle. You know, it's, and I'll show you how much we get, but it's a very tiny effect. Just so you can defend yourself, people will often say, yeah, yes, but isn't methane 30 times more potent than CO2? And you can answer, yes, it is. Per methane molecule, you get 30 times more warming than per added CO2 molecule, but then they never take the next step and say that there's 1,000 times more CO2 increase than methane increase, and so it really doesn't matter, because if you've got a little effect but there's not much of you, nothing to worry about. So here's a summary of measured methane from 1985 to 225. It is increasing, not very dramatically, much slower than CO2. Nobody's quite sure the cause of this increase. It probably is connected to the warming, but has nothing to do with people. And you can also calculate how much of this has to come from ruminants, because it's really true that ruminants burp a lot of methane. And so it turns out that if you do a simple calculation, there are 1.6 billion cows in the world. Each cow emits about 70 kilograms of methane per year. You can measure this. It's a well-known number. And methane hangs around by a little less than 10 years in the atmosphere. And so that gives cattle a contribution of about 17%. This is a straightforward calculation. I won't publicly do it, but so cattle are significant. I wouldn't say terribly important for the methane balance. So if you kill all the cattle, as I mentioned, you get a saving of 0.04 degrees centigrade from killing 1.6 million cattle. If you double CO2, you get 0.71 centigrade. We may double CO2 in a century. Neither of these, especially this one from methane, is very worrisome. And so it doesn't justify a climate emergency. You keep reading about the climate emergency, and is this really a climate emergency? You know, come on, man. So what do? Well, the alarmist establishment has invoked enormous positive feedbacks from water vapor, clouds, whatever seems plausible to increase these predicted warmings, these predicted temperature changes from increasing CO2 or increasing methane. And so I like to sometimes call it affirmative action for greenhouse gases. I've seen lots of affirmative action students in teaching at Princeton, and it doesn't really work very well. So the problem with positive feedbacks is that most natural feedbacks in nature are negative. You know, positive feedback is very unusual. There are some, but they're usually not natural. For example, dynamite has positive feedback. If you tickle dynamite too much, you know, that little heating all of a sudden turns into an explosive. So most systems with positive feedbacks are explosive. And so if the Earth really were a positive feedback system, it would have exploded a long time ago with a tipping point, and yet the geological record is very clear. The Earth has been stable for 4 billion years. You know, it's like other natural systems. Whatever feedbacks it has in climate, they're either small or most likely negative. So let me conclude with just a few words about agriculture, because this particular talk and our trip to New Zealand was driven by agriculture and farmers. And when I go to academic meetings and I show this picture and I ask my academic friends, what is this plant? Nobody knows. They, you know, people say, is it marijuana? Well, I'm sure everyone here knows this is soybeans. And another interesting thing about this is clearly genetically engineered soybeans. How do you know that? How do you know this is genetically engineered? No weeds, exactly, no weeds. So this field has been sprayed a few times with Roundup to kill all the weeds. The soybeans don't care, they're resistant to that. And so soybean yields have gone through the roof, you know, it's been bad for the prices actually. So there are two reasons that CO2 helps plants, and now I'm speaking for the CO2 Coalition, where we firmly believe that CO2 is really a benefit to the world. And the first main reason is plants need less water if there's more CO2, and plants aren't dumb, you know, they have to get CO2 through holes in their leaves, and the holes that the CO2 comes in, they leak water the other way. So the plant, not being dumb, if it sees more CO2 in the air, it just makes fewer holes in the next leaf that it grows, and so it's more resistant to drought. And you see all over the world that desert areas are shrinking at their edges because of the increased amounts of CO2 plants can grow in previously too dry areas. Okay, and then there's another one that's more interesting academically, and that's there's a plant photosynthesized with this factory I mentioned. That it's an enzyme called Rubisco, which was invented probably 4 billion years, 3.5, 4 billion years ago. Very, very ancient enzyme. And it's the enzyme that takes carbon dioxide and combines it with water to make sugar and all the rest of the molecules of life. It's the key enzyme of life, Rubisco. And when this was designed, the chief engineer for designing Rubisco made a mistake. The mistake was this stupid enzyme is sensitive to oxygen. It didn't matter 4 billion years ago because there wasn't any oxygen in the air, but now there's lots of oxygen in the air. And so Rubisco molecules, maybe I have a picture of one. Yeah, here's a Rubisco molecule. Every now and then it makes a mistake if it can't find a CO2 when CO2 levels are low, and they are low now. It uses an oxygen instead, and it makes nasty substances which it later has to clean up. They don't help it at all, they hurt it. And so for soybeans, for example, about 30% of the potential yield of soybeans has been lost because of this photooxidation, the fact that the leaf has mistaken an oxygen molecule for a CO2 molecule. So one of the reasons that soybeans do a lot better now as CO2 is increasing is it makes fewer and fewer mistakes because there's more CO2 and less a chance for it to pick up an oxygen by mistake. So the suppression of photorespiration is the second important advantage of more CO2. Yeah, I think you know there are two main types of crop plants that we use. The great majority of crop plants and all trees use the C3 photosynthetic system that Calvin worked out at Berkeley, you know, back in the 40s and 50s. But there are important plants, corn being one of them, sugarcane being another, which are adapted to very low carbon dioxide levels. And so these plants are not affected by photorespiration, but they are affected by drought. So both plants are doing much better, both types. But we expect this type to do even better because it gets this additional benefit from the suppression of photorespiration. Here you can see the greening of the earth. I think you've seen many pictures. This keeps reproducing. At first, people thought it was a mistake, but now it's been again and again reproduced. So the earth is definitely greening, especially arid regions. Here's the Sahel. Here's the western US, Canada, Western Australia. And that's because of the increased water efficiency from more CO2. In fact, that's the only thing you can point to that is clearly due to more CO2 today. there's no evidence that the temperature has had much consequence from CO2 or storms, or none of that makes any sense, but this is true. Okay? And then this is actually good for us. Okay, so this, I hope, is the end of one final, maybe it isn't the final, but one more episode of an extraordinary popular delusion and the madness of crowds. Lots and lots of people, decent people, have been brainwashed into thinking that there's a crisis and therefore we have to fix it. I mean, if I thought there were a crisis, I would be on the other side, but I know enough physics to know there isn't a crisis. But many people don't know, so they're easily deceived. And I think that's coming to an end, at least in the United States, and hopefully the rest of the world will follow. India and China have never believed this to begin with. And well, thank you. I'll stop at this point.